Imagine it is the 14th of September 2008. You are a 43-year-old mid-level bank manager living in Greenwich, Connecticut. Your house is worth roughly $1.2 million on paper. You have a 401k, that is a retirement savings account your employer helps you build, worth around $340,000. You drive a reliable car. Your kids are in good schools. Every Sunday morning you drink coffee on your back porch and feel quietly but genuinely that you have made it. You worked hard. You played by the rules. You saved consistently. You trusted the system because the system, for most of your adult life, had given you no real reason not to. That Monday morning, you go to work. The news is loud but manageable, or so it seems. Lehman Brothers, one of the largest investment banks in the world, has just filed for bankruptcy. You hear the word contagion on the radio. You do not quite know what it means for you personally. Not yet. But somewhere across the city, in a quiet office with views of Central Park, a different kind of decision is being made. A man who manages money for some of the wealthiest families in America is already 3 moves ahead. He's been moving for months, not dramatically, not loudly, quietly, methodically, like someone who has read this particular chapter of history before. If you have ever wondered why financial crises always seem to make the wealthy wealthier while everyone else loses decades of progress in a matter of months, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has played out in Germany, in Argentina, in Cyprus, in Russia, in Japan, and in the United States itself. It happens in democracies and dictatorships alike. It happens in rich countries and poor ones. And it always, without exception, ends the same way. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Because the truth is this: before markets begin to panic publicly, before the news anchors start using the word crisis on television, before ordinary people begin to feel afraid, a quiet, largely invisible repositioning is already underway among those who have seen this pattern before or who have access to the people who have. This video is about what that repositioning looks like, why it happens, what history tells us about its mechanics, and what ordinary people experienced in its wake. This is not about conspiracy. This is about pattern recognition applied to the historical record. And the record is extensive. Before we go further, there is something important to understand about how financial panics actually work, because most people have the sequence backwards. They think the collapse causes the fear. In reality, the fear causes the collapse. But even before the fear becomes visible, there is a period, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, when certain signals are already flashing for those who know how to read them. Think of it like a dam. The water pressure has been building for years. Most people see only the smooth concrete face. But the engineers who built it, who measure the stress fractures weekly, who understand the load tolerances, they see something very different. And what they do with that information determines whether they are upstream or downstream when the wall finally gives. This is the mechanism at the heart of every story you're about to hear. Wealth does not vanish in a crisis. It transfers. It moves from those who do not see it coming to those who do. It moves from liquid assets like cash and bonds into hard assets, things like land, gold, foreign currency, and productive businesses, before the general public understands why that movement matters. And then, after the panic peaks, it moves back, quietly, efficiently, at prices that would have seemed impossible just a year before. The wealthy do not get richer because they are luckier. They get richer because in the critical window before panic becomes visible, they are already moving. This is the pattern, and history has documented it in extraordinary detail. This brings us directly to the first case study, and it is one of the most dramatic examples the modern world has produced. It is March of 2001. Argentina has been in economic trouble for years, but the government has been insisting, loudly and repeatedly, that everything is under control. The peso is pegged to the US dollar, meaning 1 peso equals $1, guaranteed by law. This sounds reassuring, and for ordinary Argentines it is. The middle class has been happily saving in pesos, taking out mortgages in pesos, building businesses in pesos, because the government has promised that a peso will always be worth $1. Banks are full. Confidence is visible. The streets of Buenos Aires are busy with commerce. But by the spring of 2001, behind the scenes, the numbers no longer add up. Argentina's debt load is crushing. The International Monetary Fund, essentially a global emergency lender for countries in financial trouble, is watching closely and beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. The government is burning through its dollar reserves, the actual dollars it needs to back up its promise that each peso equals $1 at an alarming rate. What is extraordinary about the Argentine case is how clearly documented the early movement of capital was. As early as mid-2001, wealthy Argentines, particularly those with connections to international banking or with memories of earlier Argentine crises in the 1970s and 1980s, began quietly moving their savings out, not all at once, not in ways that would trigger alarm, but steadily. Estimates suggest that between January and November of 2001, $12 to $15 billion left Argentina. That is money belonging to people who had connections, who could read the signals, who did not wait for official confirmation. What happened to everyone else? In December of 2001, the government froze bank accounts. Argentines woke up one morning and found they could withdraw no more than $250 per week from their own savings. The measure was called the corralito, which translates roughly to the little corral or the little fence. It is a fitting image. Ordinary savers were penned in. Their money was technically still there in the numbers on a screen, but they could not reach it. The peso was eventually devalued catastrophically. 1 peso no longer equaled $1. It took roughly 3 pesos to equal $1 almost overnight, and eventually closer to 4. For anyone who had saved in pesos expecting dollar parity, their savings had just lost 75% of their value in a matter of weeks. The middle class was devastated. Business owners who had taken out dollar-denominated loans but earned in pesos were suddenly insolvent overnight. Unemployment hit rates above 20%. Meanwhile, those who had moved their dollars to foreign accounts months earlier watched from a safer distance as the peso collapsed. And then, as property prices in Buenos Aires fell by 40, 50, 60% in dollar terms, they began quietly buying back in. The same pattern, different direction. The transfer was complete. Here's something I want you to think about before we go further. Argentina had experienced a major currency crisis before in 1989, and yet millions of ordinary people still did not see December 2001 coming. What does it take for a society to collectively ignore a pattern that has already happened within living memory? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. And it changes everything about how you understand the events that followed. This leads to the second part of this story, and it takes us to a very different place, the island of Cyprus in 2012 and 2013. Cyprus is a small country in the Mediterranean with a banking sector that had grown extraordinarily large relative to the size of its economy. The banks had been offering high interest rates and attracting billions of euros from foreign depositors, particularly from Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe. By 2012, the Cypriot banking sector held assets worth around 8 times the country's entire annual economic output. That ratio, assets to GDP, which is a measure of a country's total economic production, was among the highest in Europe, and it was deeply structurally unstable. By mid-2012, the Cypriot government was in serious trouble. It had been lending its banks money it was running out of. The banks themselves had made catastrophic bets on Greek government debt, which had just been restructured, meaning investors had taken enormous losses. Cyprus needed a bailout from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund. What followed has entered the history books as one of the most naked and visible examples of what economists call a bail-in, which means, unlike a bailout where outside money rescues a bank, in a bail-in the depositors themselves lose a portion of their savings to recapitalize the bank. The mechanism works like this. The bank is technically insolvent, meaning it does not have enough money to pay back what it owes. Rather than letting it collapse or using taxpayer money from other countries to save it, regulators decide that large depositors will have their savings converted into shares. In practice, depositors lost an estimated 30 to 40% of any savings above the protected threshold. But here is the part that is less discussed in standard accounts of the Cyprus crisis. In the weeks before the bail-in was officially announced, the banks of Cyprus had processed a significant and unusual volume of wire transfers out of the country. Reporting by the Cypriot Parliament's own investigating committee later estimated that hundreds of millions of euros had left the island in the days immediately before the announcement. Some of these transfers were linked to individuals and entities with close political connections. The movement happened inside the window. The bank doors were locked on the morning of March 16, 2013. But by then, certain funds were already safely on the other side of the world. Ordinary Cypriot savers, pensioners, small business owners, families with years of accumulated savings received no such advance warning. They arrived at ATMs that were dispensing limited amounts. They watched their savings statements show numbers that no longer reflected accessible reality. For those with large deposits in Lakey Bank, the losses were total. Lakey Bank was wound down entirely. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because the Cypriot case shares its essential structure with a third example that unfolded over a much longer period. In a much larger country, with much more historically visible consequences, we are going back to Weimar Germany between 1921 and 1923. Germany after World War I was economically destroyed. The country owed staggering reparations under the Treaty of Versailles, roughly 132 billion gold marks. The government's solution, in its simplest form, was to print money, not carefully, not in controlled amounts, catastrophically. What followed was hyperinflation, which means prices rising so fast that money becomes worthless faster than you can spend it, of a kind that has few parallels. By November of 1923, The exchange rate between German marks and US dollars was 4 trillion marks to $1. A loaf of bread that cost roughly 160 marks in 1922 cost 200 billion marks by late 1923. People carried money in wheelbarrows. Workers were paid twice a day and sent their wages home immediately by bicycle. Because by the afternoon, the purchasing power of the money would have declined further. The German middle class was financially annihilated. Their savings were now literally worth less than the paper they were printed on. But German industrialists understood something the ordinary saver did not. Men like Hugo Stinnes, who has sometimes been called the king of inflation, had borrowed enormous sums in marks and then used those marks to buy real assets. He bought factories, mines, steel mills, ships, and newspapers. When inflation came, their debts evaporated in real terms because they repaid them in worthless marks. The factories and mines retained their productive value. Stinnes became, for a brief period, one of the wealthiest men in Germany. He owned an estimated 3,000 companies at his peak. He did not outsmart the system through genius alone. He understood the rules of debt invert. Paper wealth disappears. Hard assets survive. Most people will never know what you now know about this pattern. Most people will look at Weimar Germany as a strange historical footnote, a cautionary tale about extreme government mismanagement in a defeated nation. Most people will look at Cyprus as a small island's banking crisis with little relevance to their own savings. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not fully understand because trusting them has mostly worked so far. If you're still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now observe what all three of these cases, Argentina, Cyprus, and Weimar Germany, have in common. In every single case, the mechanism was the same. There was an extended period during which the structural problems were visible to anyone who knew how to read the data, debt levels that could not be sustained, currency pegs that could not be maintained, banking sectors that were dangerously overleveraged. There was a period of official confidence as reality deteriorated. There was a window varying in length from weeks to months, during which capital began moving toward hard assets and out of the domestic financial system. This happened among those with access and knowledge. And then there was the visible crisis, the moment ordinary people found out, followed by the collapse. The transfer is always the same. The specifics change. The country changes. The currency changes. The decade changes. But the mechanism does not. Money moves from paper to physical, from domestic to foreign, from exposed to protected, and it moves before the panic is public. After the panic is public, it is already too late to move with any efficiency. What you are witnessing on television is not the crisis itself. It is the announcement that the crisis has already happened for the people at the top of the information chain. This leads us to the human cost. In Russia, in 1998, the government defaulted on its domestic debt and devalued the ruble. In a single month, the ruble lost nearly 70% of its value. Russian middle-class savers, who had spent nearly a decade rebuilding modest prosperity, lost most of what they had saved in ruble-denominated accounts. A person with savings equivalent to $50,000 in July of 1998 had savings equivalent to roughly $15,000 in September. Not because anything was stolen from their account in any legible way, simply because the currency that denominated their savings had collapsed. What is particularly striking about the Russian case is who did not suffer in the same way. The oligarchs had already been moving their fortunes. They moved into dollar accounts, foreign real estate, and hard assets for years. Some had built structures to hold wealth outside the reach of devaluation. When the crisis hit, their wealth was largely insulated. When the recovery came, they were positioned to buy assets at post-collapse prices. In Greece, between 2010 and 2015, ordinary Greeks watched the government impose capital controls, meaning limits on how much money they could move. Pensioners who had spent 40 years contributing to the national pension system found their monthly payments cut by 20, 30, or 40%. Small business owners found credit unavailable and customers vanishing simultaneously. Meanwhile, high net worth Greeks had moved their deposits to Swiss banks. They watched from abroad as Greek property prices collapsed by 40% or more, and then some of them returned to buy. In Zimbabwe in 2008, hyperinflation reached levels that make Weimar Germany look restrained. Peak monthly inflation was 79 billion%. Salaries paid in the morning were spent before noon because by the afternoon, the money would be worth less. The formal economy stopped functioning. Those who had any access to US dollars, South African rand, or physical assets like cattle and land survived the period with their productive capacity intact. Everyone else experienced a total destruction of any accumulated savings. The pattern is relentless in its consistency. Those who hold paper, claims on systems that are under catastrophic stress, absorb the full violence of the collapse. Those who hold productive assets, foreign currency, gold, or land tend to survive. This is not because the second group is smarter. It is because they had earlier access to the information that the system was under stress, or because they had the financial means to hedge. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing. And it might change everything about how you read news. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared certain characteristics that are worth examining carefully, not as financial advice, because this channel does not give financial advice, but as pattern recognition drawn directly from the historical record. The first characteristic is that survivors maintained optionality, which simply means they kept their ability to make choices. They did not have all of their assets in one form, in one country, in one currency, or in one institution. They split between domestic and foreign accounts. In Argentina, in 2001, the people who survived were generally those who had spread their assets across multiple jurisdictions. Uruguay and the US were common. They were not necessarily wealthy by global standards. Some were middle-class families who had learned from the 1989 hyperinflation. Optionality is not purely a luxury of the ultra-rich. In many cases, it was accessible to the informed middle class. The difference was information and the willingness to act on it early, before the cost of acting became prohibitive. The second characteristic shared by survivors is an early move toward things that are difficult for governments to confiscate or to devalue unilaterally. In the Weimar period, this was industrial assets. In Cyprus, this was funds held outside the Cypriot banking jurisdiction. In Russia, this was dollar holdings. Across every case, the historical record shows a consistent preference for assets that do not depend on a single government's willingness to honor obligations. The third characteristic is the ability to act on information before it becomes consensus. In every case, the signals were visible before the crisis. Argentine debt dynamics were measurable. Cyprus's banking sector size was publicly available in 2011. Weimar money printing was a matter of public policy. The challenge is not finding the information. The challenge is acting on information that official narratives are still actively contradicting. Now, let us return to the man on the back porch in Greenwich, Connecticut, the bank manager, September 2008. In the 18 months that followed that Monday morning, the S&P 500 fell by approximately 57% from its peak. Home prices in many markets fell by 30 to 40%. Unemployment nearly doubled. The manager's 401k was worth something closer to $160,000. His house, which had been worth $1.2 million on paper, would not recover that nominal value for nearly a decade. He did nothing wrong. He followed conventional wisdom precisely. He saved consistently. He invested in broadly recommended instruments. He trusted institutions that the government itself backed. And yet the outcome for him was dramatically worse than the outcome for people who had understood. They saw the structural problems in the U.S. housing market months before the Monday morning collapse. Hedge fund managers made billions by betting against it. The mechanics that made these bets possible were not hidden. They were in publicly available data on mortgage delinquency rates and price-to-income ratios. The information existed. The interpretation was the difference. This is not comfortable knowledge. It forces a reckoning with financial systems. Are they designed to work for everyone, or structured to advantage those with superior information access and asset diversification? History's answer to that question is not ambiguous. Every major crisis in the record has involved a transfer of wealth. The crash is not the cause of that transfer. It is the mechanism through which a transfer that was already underway becomes irreversible. What does this mean for understanding the world you live in right now? This channel does not make predictions or specific warnings, but the historical pattern is worth holding in mind as a lens. Look at debt levels reaching historically unusual heights. Look at interest rate environments shifting dramatically, or currency dynamics showing unusual stress. These are conditions that preceded windows of movement. Dismissing the pattern requires a very strong theory about why this time is different. History has rarely rewarded the assumption that this time is different. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is unique and depends on many personal factors. Please consult a qualified financial professional before making any financial decision. The purpose of this channel is to help you understand patterns. This video is not for everyone. Most people will watch it and feel uncomfortable and then go back to doing exactly what they were doing before. That is a reasonable response. But if one person in your life is sitting on a porch somewhere, trusting a system they have never examined, share this. It costs nothing and it might help them ask better questions. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of historical analysis. I will see you in the next one.